He had never been one to question the eccentricity of his clients. As a freelance architect specializing in unconventional projects, Jake Hart had seen it all. Hidden panic rooms, underground lairs, even a house designed entirely upside down. So when Sean Diddy Combs, the enigmatic music mogul, reached out with a cryptic request to design a series of secret tunnels beneath his sprawling Los Angeles estate, Jake didn't blink. The opportunity was too lucrative, the challenge too enticing to resist. Little did he know the decision to take this job would unravel a nightmare he could never escape. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The initial meeting was held at Diddy's mansion, an opulent structure that loomed over the Hollywood Hills like a monument to excess. Jake was ushered through grandiose hallways adorned with platinum records and artwork worth more than he'd make in a lifetime. The staff was professional but tight-lipped, their expressions betraying nothing. Diddy himself was as charismatic and intense as Jake had imagined, exuding an aura of both confidence and control. "We're talking discretion here," Diddy had said, his voice low and deliberate. "No one, and I mean no one, can know about this project. These tunnels aren't just for show, they're a necessity." Jake tried to pry further. Was this about privacy, security, or something else entirely? But Diddy's sharp gaze cut through his questions like a blade. "Just get it done," he said. "You'll be well compensated." Jake's curiosity was piqued, but he knew better than to press. He signed the NDA, accepted the hefty advance, and began the preliminary designs. The project specifications were detailed but vague. The tunnels needed to be extensive, connecting various points of the estate, and structurally sound enough to endure any seismic activity. Diddy also requested a hidden entrance accessible only through biometric scans. The meticulousness of the requirements made Jake wonder if this was more than just a vanity project. As the weeks went on, Jake immersed himself in the work. The technical challenges were exhilarating, and the pressure to meet Diddy's exacting standards pushed him to his limits. Yet, the more he delved into the logistics, the more anomalies he encountered. The layout of the tunnels was peculiar, branching out like veins from the mansion's core. Some passages seemed to lead to dead ends, while others spiraled downward into uncharted depths. One night, while reviewing blueprints, Jake received an unexpected call from Diddy. His voice was uncharacteristically strained. "Make sure there are no leaks, Jake," he said. "No mistakes. I'm trusting you." The line went dead before Jake could respond. His unease began to grow, but he convinced himself it was nothing more than the pressure of the job. After all, celebrities were known for their quirks. He buried his doubts and pressed forward, determined to deliver. Construction began in earnest, and that's when things took a turn. The crew, handpicked by Diddy's team, worked with military-like precision. They were professionals, but even they couldn't hide their unease. Strange things started happening, tools disappearing, unexplained power outages, and an oppressive feeling that seemed to linger in the deepest parts of the tunnels. Jake dismissed the incidents as stress-induced paranoia, until the first discovery. During an excavation, the workers uncovered something unexpected, a chamber that wasn't in Jake's designs. It was ancient, its walls carved with symbols that none of them could decipher. The air inside was heavy, thick with a metallic tang that made it hard to breathe. At the center of the chamber stood an altar, its surface stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Jake reported the find to Diddy, expecting him to order a halt to the construction. Instead, Diddy's reaction was chillingly calm. "Seal it up," he said, "and don't mention it again." Jake's unease deepened, but he obeyed. The chamber was sealed, and the work continued. Yet, from that point on, the atmosphere in the tunnels grew darker. Workers began quitting without explanation, their faces pale and haunted. The few who stayed whispered about strange sounds, whispers that echoed through the tunnels when no one was around. Jake tried to focus on the task at hand, but his sleep was plagued by nightmares of the chamber and its ominous altar. He started spending long hours in the tunnels, driven by a compulsion to understand what he was building. The more he explored, the more he felt an inexplicable pull toward the sealed chamber. Against his better judgment, he returned to it one night armed with a crowbar and a flashlight. Breaking through the seal felt like a violation, but curiosity overpowered his fear. The chamber was as he remembered, but something was different. The air was colder, and the symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. Jake approached the altar, his heart pounding. There he found a small weathered journal bound in cracked leather. Its pages were filled with illegible scrawls and sketches of grotesque figures that seemed to twist and writhe as he stared at them. A sudden sound behind him made him whirl around. The tunnels were empty, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was undeniable. Jake fled, clutching the journal, his mind racing with questions. Who had built the chamber and why? And what was Diddy's connection to it? The journal became an obsession. Jake spent hours poring over its pages, trying to decode the symbols and sketches. His research led him down a rabbit hole of occult lore, ancient rituals, and whispered legends of secret societies. The pieces began to fit together, and a chilling picture emerged. The chamber wasn't just a relic, it was a gateway, a conduit for something dark and otherworldly. Jake confronted Diddy, armed with his findings. He demanded answers, but Diddy's demeanor was unshakable. "You've done your job, Jake," he said, his tone icy. "Take your money and walk away." But Jake couldn't let it go. The weight of what he had uncovered was too great. He began to investigate on his own, delving into the mansion's history and the land it was built on. He discovered whispers of disappearances, strange occurrences, and rumors of rituals conducted in secret. The more he learned, the more he realized that Diddy's tunnels weren't just about privacy or security. They were about power. As Jake's obsession consumed him, his life began to unravel. He lost clients, friends, and sleep. The journal seemed to haunt him, its pages filling his mind with images he couldn't escape. He started hearing the whispers himself, faint and insistent, calling him back to the tunnels. As he stood there, paralyzed with fear, he felt a presence behind him. Turning slowly, he came face to face with Diddy. But the man before him wasn't the confident mogul he'd met months ago. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his face twisted into a cruel smile. "You should have walked away, Jake," Diddy said, his voice distorted. "Some doors aren't meant to be opened." The last thing Jake saw before everything went dark was the chamber erupting with blinding light and the sound of whispers turning into a deafening roar. Jake woke up days later in a hospital bed, his memory of the incident fragmented and surreal. The mansion was gone, destroyed in what the news called a freak accident. Diddy had vanished, leaving behind a legacy shrouded in mystery. Jake tried to move on, but the experience had left him scarred. The whispers still haunted him, a constant reminder of the darkness he had uncovered. He had been hired to design secret tunnels, but what he discovered beneath the surface was something far more sinister, a secret that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The weeks that followed Jake's awakening in the hospital were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. Despite the doctor's assurances that he was physically fine, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had brought something back with him. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of his vision, and the whispers he'd heard in the tunnels were now part of his every waking moment, a persistent murmur at the edge of perception. He tried to immerse himself in work, but his reputation as an architect had taken a hit. News of the freak accident at Diddy's estate had sparked wild rumors, and Jake's association with the project made him a pariah among potential clients. Some whispered that he was cursed, while others dismissed him as a fraud. The truth, of course, was far worse. Jake had been avoiding the journal since the hospital, locking it away in a steel safe in his apartment. But no matter how far he pushed it out of sight, he couldn't escape the sense that it was calling to him. Finally, one sleepless night, he gave in. With trembling hands, he retrieved the journal and flipped through its pages. The grotesque figures still seemed to writhe on the parchment, and the symbols seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of his desk lamp. But now, new words had appeared. Words in English scrawled hastily in the margins. "The gateway remains open." Jake's blood ran cold. He hadn't written those words, nor had they been there before. His mind raced as he tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he had overlooked them in his initial frenzy of decoding. But deep down, he knew the truth. The journal was changing, responding to him, or worse, to whatever force had awakened in the tunnels. Desperation drove him to seek answers. He contacted the few remaining workers who had been part of the project, but most refused to speak to him. Those who did shared only cryptic warnings, dreams of fire and shadows, a lingering sense of dread that had driven them to leave the construction site. One man, a grizzled foreman named Luis, revealed that he had seen Diddy in the tunnels late at night, standing motionless before the sealed chamber, as if in a trance. He wasn't himself, Luis said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes, they weren't human. Jake's search for clarity led him to an expert in occult studies, a reclusive professor named Dr. Margot Thorne. Her home, a cluttered maze of books and artifacts, was a stark contrast to the polished opulence of Diddy's mansion. Dr. Thorne listened intently as Jake recounted his story, her expression growing graver with each detail. "You've encountered something ancient," she said finally, her voice heavy with concern. "The symbols you describe are associated with rituals meant to summon entities from beyond our world. Such gateways are incredibly dangerous, often unstable. If Diddy's tunnels were built with that chamber as their focal point, it suggests a deliberate attempt to channel immense energy." Jake asked what he could do to stop it, but Dr. Thorne's response was bleak. Once a gateway is opened, it cannot simply be closed. The connection must be severed at its source, and that often comes at a great cost. Worse still, these entities are opportunistic. They latch onto those who disturb them, feeding on fear and despair. Her words confirmed Jake's worst fears. The whispers, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. It was all part of the entity's growing influence. Dr. Thorne suggested a ritual that might weaken its hold, but it required dangerous components and a level of focus that Jake wasn't sure he possessed. Still, he was willing to try anything to rid himself of the nightmare that had consumed his life. The ritual preparation was grueling. Jake had to gather rare ingredients: black salt, obsidian shards, and a specific herb known as wolfsbane. These items weren't easy to come by, and Jake found himself navigating a shadowy underworld of occult suppliers and dubious dealers. He drained his savings and endured sleepless nights researching every step of the process. Throughout it all, the journal seemed to mock him, its pages shifting and adding new cryptic warnings. When everything was finally in place, Jake performed the ritual in the dead of night, following Dr. Thorne's precise instructions. He carved a protective circle into the floor of his apartment, arranged the ingredients, and chanted the incantations with trembling conviction. The air grew heavy, and the temperature plummeted. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and shadows writhed like living things against the walls. For a moment, Jake thought he had succeeded. The room fell silent, and the oppressive presence seemed to lift. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, a figure, impossibly tall and gaunt, standing just outside the circle. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its elongated fingers seemed to twitch with malevolent intent. "You cannot escape!" it hissed, its voice a chorus of whispers. "The gateway binds us now!" Jake collapsed as the figure dissolved into darkness. The ritual had failed, or worse, it had strengthened the connection. His only hope was to return to the source, to confront the gateway directly. But with Diddy's mansion reduced to rubble, he had no idea where to begin. In a last-ditch effort, Jake retraced his steps, poring over construction records and satellite images of the property. He discovered something startling. The mansion's foundations extended deeper than he had initially realized, into a network of natural caverns. Even with the mansion destroyed, the tunnels and the chamber might still exist. Armed with a flashlight, climbing gear, and a renewed sense of purpose, Jake returned to the site. The area was cordoned off, but he managed to slip past the perimeter under cover of darkness. The once grand estate was now a wasteland of rubble and ash, but Jake's instincts led him to a partially collapsed opening that might have been part of the original tunnel system. The descent was treacherous. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls seemed to close in around him. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, guiding him deeper into the earth. After what felt like hours, Jake reached the chamber. It was intact, but changed. The altar was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of light and shadow at the center of the room. The walls pulsed with an otherworldly glow, and the symbols seemed to shift and writhe of their own accord. The presence in the room was suffocating, a palpable force that pressed against Jake's chest. Summoning every ounce of courage, Jake approached the vortex. He realized that the journal had been a key all along, a guide to this moment. Clutching it tightly, he began to chant the incantations he had memorized, his voice shaking but resolute. The vortex responded violently, lashing out with tendrils of darkness that sliced through the air. Jake held his ground, his voice growing louder as he poured all his energy into the chant. The room seemed to shudder, the walls trembling as the vortex began to collapse in on itself. But the entity wasn't going down without a fight. The figure from his apartment appeared again, its form more defined and menacing. It lunged at Jake, its burning eyes locked onto his. With a final desperate effort, Jake threw the journal into the vortex. The pages erupted into flames, and the vortex imploded with a deafening roar, pulling the entity into its depths. When Jake woke, he was lying on the surface, surrounded by dawn's pale light. The rubble of the mansion was silent, and the oppressive presence was gone. The journal was nowhere to be found, and for the first time in months, the whispers had ceased. Jake's ordeal was over, but the scars remained. He couldn't erase the memories of what he had seen, nor could he forget the cost of his discovery. He knew that the gateway was closed, but the knowledge of its existence and the entities that had tried to cross it would haunt him forever. In the years that followed, Jake abandoned architecture, retreating to a quiet life in a remote cabin far from the chaos of the city. He never spoke of what had happened, not even to Dr. Thorne, who had tried to reach him multiple times. The world moved on, and the mystery of Diddy's tunnels faded into obscurity. But sometimes, late at night, Jake would wake to the faintest sound of whispers, a reminder that some doors are better left unopened. Jake Hart's retreat to solitude did little to mend the cracks in his psyche. The nightmares were persistent and vivid, taking him back to the suffocating darkness of the tunnels and the malevolent figure that had nearly ended his life. His remote cabin, surrounded by endless pines and far from any prying eyes, became both a sanctuary and a prison. Every creak of the old wooden beams, every rustle of the forest outside his window felt like the breath of something lurking just beyond sight. He thought often about the vortex, the journal, and the entity he had banished, or thought he had. While the whispers no longer accompanied his waking hours, the scars ran deeper than auditory hallucinations. Jake had touched something beyond human comprehension, and that knowledge festered within him, a splinter in his mind. Desperate to occupy himself, Jake began documenting everything he could remember about the tunnels, the symbols, and the vortex. He kept a meticulous record in leather-bound journals, filling page after page with sketches of the runes and diagrams of the chamber. His goal wasn't just to preserve the memory, but to understand it, to make sense of the chaos. Yet the more he wrote, the more questions arose. Who had created the chamber originally? Why had Diddy been so insistent on its secrecy? And most troubling of all, what had the entity wanted? Jake's isolation began to unravel when he received an unmarked package at his cabin. The sight of the delivery startled him. He had taken great pains to ensure no one could track him to this remote location. The package was small, wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a single object inside, a charred fragment of the original journal he had burned in the vortex. The fragment contained only a few legible lines, but they were enough to send Jake's heart racing. The gateway is never truly closed. It waits for the right hand to reopen it. Jake staggered back, dropping the fragment as if it had burned him. How had the journal survived? Who had sent it? His thoughts spiraled into paranoia. He checked every lock on his doors and windows, then began scouting the perimeter of his property. There were no signs of intrusion, no tire tracks or footprints, yet the package had made its way to him. The silence of the forest seemed to mock him, its stillness a stark contrast to the storm of fear in his mind. Unable to shake the implications of the message, Jake sought out Dr. Margot Thorne once again. She was surprised to hear from him after so long, but her concern outweighed her curiosity. When he arrived at her home, disheveled and haunted, she immediately noticed the weight he carried. He recounted the delivery of the fragment, showing it to her with reluctant hands. Dr. Thorne examined it carefully, her brow furrowed. "This is no coincidence," she said gravely. "Something or someone knows you're connected to the gateway. They're trying to draw you back." Jake's protests were weak. "I destroyed the vortex. I closed the gateway." "You disrupted it," Thorne corrected. "But closing something like this is complicated. You might have severed the entity's direct connection, but the gateway itself isn't gone. If this fragment exists, then the danger hasn't passed." Dr. Thorne proposed a bold plan to trace the origins of the symbols and rituals associated with the chamber. She believed that understanding the history of the gateway might provide a way to permanently seal it. Jake, reluctant but desperate for peace, agreed. Their research took them across the country, from dusty archives in university libraries to obscure occult shops hidden in the back streets of major cities. They unearthed fragments of stories, legends of ancient civilizations that had experimented with summoning rituals, artifacts linked to unexplainable phenomena, and whispers of cults dedicated to the unseen ones. One breakthrough came when they uncovered an ancient manuscript in the archives of a private collector. The manuscript, written in a dead language, contained diagrams eerily similar to the chamber Jake had seen. With the help of a linguist, they translated the text. It described a ritual designed to bind an interdimensional entity to a specific location, ensuring it could not spread its influence beyond its confines. However, the manuscript also warned that the binding was fragile and required periodic reinforcement. Jake's stomach sank as he read the final line of the translation. "The binding weakens when forgotten. Only vigilant hands keep the darkness at bay." It dawned on him that Diddy's secret tunnels might not have been an act of hubris or curiosity. They could have been an attempt, however misguided, to maintain the binding. Perhaps Diddy had discovered the chamber's true purpose and had taken it upon himself to ensure it remained secure. But if that was the case, why had the vortex been active when Jake entered the chamber? Their search for answers led them to a remote village in Eastern Europe, where local folklore spoke of a similar phenomenon, a well of shadows that had terrorized the region centuries ago. The villagers claimed that a group of mystics had sealed the well with a ritual so complex it had taken years to perform. Jake and Dr. Thorne traveled to the site, now a crumbling ruin overgrown with moss and vines. At the center of the ruins was a stone platform covered in weathered symbols. Jake felt a chill as he recognized some of the markings. They were identical to those in Diddy's chamber. The platform radiated a faint hum, a vibration that seemed to resonate in Jake's bones. He could feel the echoes of the power that had once surged through the place. A local historian explained that the mystic's ritual had required a willing sacrifice, someone bound to the entity by choice. Without this offering, the gateway couldn't be fully sealed. Jake's mind raced as he processed the implications. Was this why Diddy had been so adamant about secrecy? Had he been preparing for a sacrifice, and if so, had Jake's interference disrupted his plan? The realization left Jake with a grim choice. If the gateway beneath Diddy's estate was still active, the only way to permanently close it might involve a similar sacrifice. The weight of that possibility loomed over him, but he couldn't deny the responsibility he felt. He had been the one to disturb the chamber. He had set these events into motion. Dr. Thorne, sensing his turmoil, offered a sliver of hope. There might be another way, she said. An artifact mentioned in the ancient manuscript, a relic said to amplify the binding ritual's power without requiring a life. Known as the Seal of Eons, it was rumored to have been lost centuries ago, but Thorne believed it could still exist. Their search for the seal became a race against time. Jake's nightmares returned with a vengeance, and the whispers began to creep back into his waking hours. He knew the entity was growing stronger, its influence spreading as the binding weakened. The urgency of their mission pushed them to the brink of exhaustion. With the seal in hand, they returned to the ruins of Diddy's estate. The site was as desolate as Jake remembered, but the air was heavier, charged with a palpable tension. The whispers were deafening now, a constant reminder of the entity's presence. Dr. Thorne guided Jake through the preparation of the ritual. The Seal of Aeons was placed at the center of the chamber, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to glow in the dim light. Jake, standing within a protective circle, began the incantation. The chamber responded violently, the vortex reappearing in a maelstrom of light and shadow. The entity emerged once more, its form more defined and menacing than ever. It lashed out, but the seal's power held it at bay. Jake poured every ounce of his will into the chant, his voice rising above the cacophony. The seal pulsed with energy, its light growing brighter with each repetition of the incantation. The entity screamed, a sound that reverberated through Jake's very soul as the vortex began to collapse. The chamber trembled, the walls cracking under the strain. But Jake held firm, pushing through the fear and exhaustion. As he and Dr. Thorne emerged from the ruins, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The weight that had pressed on Jake's chest for so long was gone, replaced by a fragile sense of peace. The gateway was closed, this time for good. In the years that followed, Jake disappeared from public life entirely. He moved to a small village far from his past, finding solace in the simplicity of a quiet existence. Dr. Thorne continued her work, documenting their journey in a book that became a cornerstone for future occult researchers. Yet, even in his quiet life, Jake couldn't escape the occasional flicker of doubt. On rare nights when the wind howled through the trees, he thought he heard faint whispers. Perhaps they were nothing more than echoes of memory, or perhaps some doors, no matter how tightly sealed, never truly stay closed. Jake Hart's new life in the secluded village was a deliberate attempt to bury the ghosts of his past. He settled in a modest stone cottage on the outskirts, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. The village itself was a quiet place, inhabited by farmers, craftsmen, and others who seemed to embrace the same solitude Jake now sought. The villagers were polite but kept their distance, sensing something unspoken in his demeanor. Jake didn't mind the isolation, he welcomed it. He spent his days tending a small vegetable garden and his nights reading books that had nothing to do with architecture or the occult. But despite his best efforts, the events surrounding Diddy's tunnels never fully left him. The scars ran deeper than he admitted, manifesting in subtle ways. A moment of hesitation when stepping into darkened rooms, a tightening in his chest when he heard the faint rustle of wind that sounded too much like whispers. One crisp autumn evening, Jake sat by the fire, a book in his lap, when there came a knock at the door. It was an unusual occurrence. The villagers rarely ventured to his cottage unless necessary. He hesitated before answering, a flicker of apprehension stirring in his gut. When he opened the door, he found a man standing on the threshold, dressed in a long coat and wearing an expression that was both weary and intense. "Mr. Hart," the man said, his voice steady but grave, "my name is Elias Crow. I need your help." Jake's immediate reaction was to refuse. He had made a vow to leave his past behind, to never again involve himself in the world of secrets and shadows. But something in Elias's tone, an urgency laced with desperation, gave him pause. "I'm not the person you're looking for," Jake said, his voice firm but quiet. "That part of my life is over." Elias didn't flinch. "I know what you've been through," he said. "The tunnels, the entity, the gateway. I know you closed it, but this isn't about what you've done. It's about what's still out there." Jake's grip tightened on the doorframe. "It's over," he insisted. "The gateway is sealed." Elias stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Not all of them." The words struck Jake like a blow to the chest. He stared at Elias, his mind racing. "What are you talking about?" Elias pulled a weathered notebook from his coat pocket and opened it to a page filled with drawings of symbols. Symbols Jake recognized immediately. His heart sank. "There are others," Elias said. "Gateways like the one you closed. Some are still dormant, but others, they're waking up, and people like you are the only ones who can stop them." Jake took a step back, the weight of the revelation threatening to crush him. He had thought his ordeal was unique, an isolated event, but now, confronted with the possibility of a larger, more insidious network of gateways, he felt the fragile peace he had built shatter. "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll have to find someone else." Elias didn't argue. He simply placed the notebook on a nearby table and nodded. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me." As the man disappeared into the night, Jake closed the door and stared at the notebook, its pages beckoning like the journal he had once tried so hard to destroy. He didn't touch it, but he knew it was only a matter of time before he did. Something inside him, something he couldn't ignore, told him this was far from over, and deep down he knew he wouldn't be able to walk away. Not this time. The hours after Elias's departure were suffocating. The notebook sat on the table like a silent accusation, its presence filling the room with a tension Jake couldn't escape. He tried to ignore it, burying himself in mundane tasks, stoking the fire, washing the few dishes in the sink, even stepping outside to split firewood under the cold moonlight. But no matter how hard he tried, his thoughts kept circling back to Elias's words. The phrase echoed in his mind, relentless and unyielding. If what Elias claimed was true, then the nightmare Jake had fought so hard to escape wasn't an isolated incident. The idea that more gateways existed, each a potential conduit for the horrors he had faced, made his stomach churn. And the symbols Elias had shown him weren't just familiar. They were identical to those he had seen in Diddy's tunnels and the ruins in Europe. By dawn, Jake sat in his small kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee untouched before him. His gaze rested on the notebook, its frayed edges illuminated by the weak sunlight filtering through the window. He knew what he had to do, even as dread coiled in his chest. This time there would be no running. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Diddy's secret tunnels and their mysterious purpose? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.